Hi, my name is Baruch Solomon, and you are Danny Shine.
Mm-hmm.
And tonight we're hoping to discuss antinatalism. And I'll ask you to explain first of all what you mean by antinatalism.
Okay. So I have some presence on the internet. I have a YouTube channel called Social
Yes,
Experimentalist, and
yes, I've seen a number of videos.
I'm yeah, and I am a father of 3 children, aged 23, 21, and 14. And
Yeah.
I only found out about antinatalism about 3 years ago. Before that, I had never even considered whether there was even any ethical question about whether it's okay or not to bring people into existence. It was just natural. I was brought up as Orthodox Jewish, and that's just what you did. It's just, it's just a matter of how many. And even the question of how many children we had, me and my wife, was it was really strange when I look back on it afterwards, because of the gravity of bringing someone into existence. And now when I look back at it, but we kind of just picked a number out of a hat. Oh yeah, well, 3 would be quite nice, So I came across antinatalism, which is basically, in a nutshell, as I understand it, antinatalism is the belief that it's not okay to bring someone into existence, that it's not acceptable for all sorts of reasons, that it's not ethically okay to bring someone into existence. I'll very briefly sort of say, one of the reasons is because you are going to be harming somebody else. You are definitely going to harm them, and we have agreed as a human race that it's not okay to harm somebody else without their consent. And as you can't get their consent, and you're definitely going to harm them, and you don't know how their life is going to turn out, therefore there is no ethical justification that it's not right to cause someone else harm and death, and therefore it's not okay to reproduce. And obviously I only found this out a lot later in life, once I'd already had 3 children, which when I speak to people about it on the streets, when they find out, I often start off by speaking about the problems of procreation, and then halfway into the conversation, quite often on the streets, people say, "Oh, have you got any children?" And I say, "Yes." And then they go, "Ah, you hypocrite." But anyway, so that's an introduction to me, and a very, very brief introduction to antinatalism. What about you?
Okay. I haven't had any children. There'd been, I'd say, a number of circumstances that would have made it impracticable to have children. Until I was in middle age, I found it extremely difficult to form relationships. I've also certainly had difficulties because I have autism, of being able to get more than menial jobs. So I've never really felt in a position to be a good provider. I'm my partner and I now are both in our 50s, so it's not going to be an option. Where I think we'd have quite a bit of agreement is that I certainly believe strongly in population control. So I certainly believe in. I would share your concern in the current world, where we've got limited resources, we've got huge environmental threats, that if population is multiplying in geometric progression, then we're in an unsustainable situation. In fact, from the statistics would show that since we were young, certainly since I was doing geography A level, enormous progress has actually been made in population control, in encouraging people to have smaller families worldwide. Where I disagree, but to me, the idea that people shouldn't have children at all sounds pretty radical. Are we talking about the end of the human race?
Well, the human race, if it is a race, humans are going to end. It is going to end. The human race will end sometime. I don't think anybody would deny that. It's just a matter of when and how. That's number one. Number two, it's kind of almost irrelevant because you know, as soon as I share these ideas, it's very, very common for people to say, yeah, but the human race is going to go extinct, like you just said. But it's not relevant because the way we have been designed by, I don't know what or who, or whether we were designed by an intelligent creator. I don't think we were. I don't think our design is very intelligent at all. I mean, it's sort of a mixture. I often say that our design and life itself is a mixture of the most incredible brilliance and the most profound stupidity all in one. And humans are like that as well. And much of what they create and do is incredibly complex and sophisticated and full of, you know, intelligence, and also an unending supply of stupidity. So
I can certainly relate to the contradiction there.
Yeah, and so therefore it's never going to happen. Never ever is it going to happen that all human beings are going to stop reproducing by themselves, by realizing, you know, there might be some problems with it, whatever the problems might be, which maybe we'll share some more reasons why it's not okay, in my opinion. That's never going to happen because people are driven by their desires and sex drives. They're driven by their DNA, which is programmed to procreate and which is working in the background all the time, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not. It's working in the background to maximize the possibility of it replicating itself. And you know, and that's even after that goes on even after a person's no longer a woman, for example, is no longer able to give birth, even past menopause. Women's behavior is still driven by the desire to be attractive, which all relates back to the idea of procreation. So although, yes, I mean, although I don't really know, I mean, I don't know why anybody would have a problem with the end of the human race, because I still can't figure out exactly what we've done here that's so good and useful. Maybe you can answer me that in a moment. But you know, the idea that the philosophical point of view that it's not okay to reproduce will only get through to a tiny number of people, and of those, you know, then only a small percentage will actually make a decision to make sure they don't reproduce. So you know, this idea is never going to go mainstream. So therefore it's not really relevant to say whether I want to see the end of the human race or not. Just like, you know, I want to see all sorts of things different, but they are not going to be different, and I don't have the control over them. So that's the response to that question. But I would throw the question back to you. Why do you want to see the human race go on and on?
I would start by saying, actually, on balance, human life is, in spite of all the awful suffering, human life is on balance more pleasant than it's unpleasant. And the evidence for that is that people who, once they're born, they pretty much they want to stay alive and they want to live as long as they can.
That is not evidence for your point. That is something that's built in, a survival instinct, and people, even in the most terrible situation and circumstances, have this drive to survive. So that's not necessarily the case. Yeah, that doesn't prove that life is more pleasant than unpleasant. That's firstly. Secondly, for many people, life is extremely unpleasant for long periods of time, and it's getting worse. The suicide rates are going up, rocketing. So and to me, even though I have an incredible life, I have an incredibly privileged life in so many ways, but that life comes at a great expense. It comes at the great expense of other people, and it comes at and it also was given to me or thrust upon me by my parents, who took a huge risk and didn't think about what the risks were at the time, just like I didn't think about what the risks I was taking with my children. Took huge risks and had no idea how it would all pan out, and no idea whether I would enjoy my life or not. No idea whether I would experience excruciating pain, suffering, depression, on all the illnesses and problems that are so common, and some that aren't so common. So for me, the only thing that really matters is the reduction of harm, the reduction of suffering, the reduction of pain. And the best way of reducing pain is not to create beings that can feel pain in the first place. Because I think that the way I see the world at the moment is that I suspect that we're living in some kind of virtual reality, like it's almost like a computer game. We're inside a computer
like the Matrix.
Game. Yeah. And I think that if I was to create a computer game, and we now, I don't know if you've now actually just recently, Facebook have come up with this VR machine, which is very reasonable. I mean, for many people, it's very reasonable. It costs less than a phone. It's called Oculus, and you can get other ones as well. Hate to do advertising for Facebook, but anyway. And you put this thing on, and it's just unbelievable. It's so real. It's incredible. Now, if I was creating a computer game with avatars in it, I would never dream of allowing those avatars to be able to feel any pain. It's a terrible, terrible idea, especially as that pain can be excruciating. And there are people right now in the world, many of them, who are in the most excruciating pain. Not so much here in the West, in the developed countries, but in the less developed countries where they can't get hold of painkillers and morphine, etc. They just are left to writhe and suffer.
I would certainly agree with you that in all sorts of respects, the suffering that we see in somewhere like the UK doesn't compare with suffering that you'll see either in impoverished countries or in oppressive regimes or places that are at war and so on, where there's often a different order of suffering.
Yeah, I agree with you. Although in places like the UK, there is still a lot of suffering, and there's still a lot of mental health problems which can be excruciatingly painful. And for me, I'm a sensitive soul, and I just cannot accept that. I cannot accept the cost, the high cost of life, the cost to other human beings that we exploit, the cost to animal life that we exploit for food, although I've stopped doing that, but most of my life I did do that. And the interesting thing, by the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning, the ironic thing is that I came across antinatalism as a result, I think, as a sort of as a result, natural kind of progression from veganism. That's how I came across the people online who talk about it, because there are a lot of antinatalists around the world, and there are not that many of them in the world, but of there are maybe thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, I don't know. But of the antinatalists in the world, there are quite a unusually high number of vegans. And once you get to veganism, and then you start to realize, hold on a second, there are loads of animals in the wild that are suffering terribly, as well as all the animals that we bring into existence just to put them in factory farms and kill them. And then I came across antinatalism. And the ironic thing about it is that my son, who was 8 at the time, decided to go vegan, and I became vegan after him. And then I found my way to antinatalism, which is sort of, ironic that in some senses my own children led me towards the ideas of antinatalism.
So your own children are to blame for you not believing in not having children?
Well, that sounds a little harsh, because that sounds like, their fault. No, it's just happened to be that's how I came across it, through my son choosing to be vegan. And so a lot of vegans find out about antinatalism because of that.
A bit of a digression. A bit of a digression here. Certainly a question. When I think about animal rights, one question that I do have is, okay, so you're a vegan, you don't raise animals for food and so on, but you're quite happy, but people are quite happy to see a pretty brutal world that animals live in the wild. They're all eating each other, they're all struggling to fill their stomachs and so on. Correct. And would your antenatal philosophy extend to saying, actually, if wild animals all become extinct, that wouldn't be such a terrible thing, because they're having a pretty, for instance, if you could give birth control to all the animals, if you could sterilize, put something in the water that sterilizes all the animals in the jungle, so they carry on with their lives, but they don't give birth at all. Would you say that was a good thing?
I mean, it's very complicated, because everything is so interconnected. It's very complicated, but in principle, I do extend this to animals, absolutely. And therefore, I am opposed to any breeding of any sentient life, because you are creating then an instrument that can and will suffer. And the animals in the wild, like you say, and there is also now a growing awareness of wild animal suffering. There are people on YouTube who speak about it. There is a very interesting guy called David Pearce, who's he calls himself a transhumanist, but I don't like that particular word. He's a very lovely and compassionate man, and I've met him a few times, and he's got a website called it's called headweb.com, and he writes very beautifully and extensively about how he envisages we can use technology to do that very thing. Gene drives, I think it's called, where you and he speaks about the removing of suffering, the eventual using technology to edit genes so that people experience less and less pain, more and more pleasure and joy. And so yes, it does extend to animals, in theory, but obviously how this is done is is beyond me, is beyond the scope of my understanding and of science or philosophy. But in
It
principle,
sounds very
in
much, and
principle,
I saw two videos where I think you had. I saw one video where you were saying this kind of thing, and another video where you were protesting. I think was Amazon opening a supermarket or something.
yes,
So
yeah,
so you'd had it looked like it was certainly post-pandemic because everybody was wearing masks,
yeah,
and
it was
people
very
had come.
recently, yeah,
So people come down. It looked like the opening of this new store. Everybody was queued up, hadn't opened
yeah,
yet, and you were you were comparing that to an Aldous Huxley dystopia. Yeah,
yeah,
the thing that you're advocating sounds very much like, because I think there was other things. I think you were advocating the idea that we divorce sex from okay, sex should be for pleasure, not for having kids,
yes.
and
I
having
would, I
kids should
mean,
be something done in a laboratory.
yeah, that well,
And
I
that is
didn't
totally,
get.
that is exactly what Brave New World is. It's
Well,
it's
it may be that's what Brave New World is, and just because it's what Brave New World is,
hmm,
doesn't necessarily mean that it's a dystopia. In fact, I think it's a utopian idea. And
right.
there was a documentary on Netflix about CRISPR. I don't know if you're aware of CRISPR. Have you heard of CRISPR?
No.
CRISPR is the gene editing technology. It's very, I would highly recommend you watch it. I can't remember what it's called, but I'll try and put it in. If I put this film up, I'll try and put it in
Mm-hmm.
the description box. But
Mm-hmm.
in that very film, they said that that's exactly what they said. They said that, in the future, sex will be for pleasure, having children will be in the laboratory. Because at the moment, what we're doing and what I did with my children is I was playing what David Pearce calls genetic crapshoot, whereby, we spin the dice, me and my wife. We didn't really think about,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't think carefully about what type of genetic makeup we were bringing into this game. But if I think about it now, and I look at my family and her family, there are lots of
Mm-hmm.
reasons to be concerned about what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So at the moment, we're just taking this huge risk. We're playing Frankenstein, and we have no
Mm-hmm.
idea what's going to come out. We have no idea what illnesses they're going to have, what disabilities they're going to have, what
Mm-hmm.
accidents they're going to experience, what mental
Mm-hmm.
health problems they may have. And in the future, I think there will be moving towards designer babies. Now, there's a lot of ethical problems with that. The dystopian part of it, which is why why I'm saying at the bottom line, I encourage people to think twice before they reproduce, because
Mm-hmm.
the dystopian part about it is that this technology can be used for, like all technology, can be used for the good and the bad. And the people that are behind the scenes and those that are in front of the cameras
Mm-hmm.
are some of the most disgraceful human beings to ever live on this planet. I mean, it's not their fault because it's their parents' fault for bringing them in here. So I don't blame Boris Johnson. I blame his parents for bringing him into existence. Plus, his conditioning, at Eton and in general, his conditioning has led him to be, it's extremely likely that he is a sociopath. And when sociopaths get hold of this technology, they're going to use it against the majority of the people and turn people into their slaves. So that's the problem with this technology. But the idea, at least in terms of
I'm no
fantasy,
fan of
as
Boris
a thought
Johnson. I
experiment.
wouldn't call him I wouldn't thought he was I wouldn't think of him as a sociopath.
No, of course you wouldn't, because he's a very, very successful sociopath. He's an actor. He's a narcissistic psychopath. I mean, you can't get into that job. I don't think you can get to run a country unless you are like that. And I might be wrong. There may have been some exceptions to that, but but that's neither here nor there whether he is or he in particular is. But the people behind the scenes with all the money and the power they are addicts. They're drunk on power and money. And, you know, I can't imagine what it'd be like to be them. It's out of my realms of possibilities, because I just don't have any experience of people like that really in my life. And you know, I don't know. But what I'm saying is that they can't be trusted. As far as I'm concerned, they absolutely can't be trusted. And therefore, this technology could be used, and probably will be used, against us all. Having said all that, the way I see sex, and I think this is something that needs to be explored in schools with young people and older people. The way I see sex is that sex developed, evolved, or was created as a way of DNA ensuring its own replication by making it feel so lovely. Yeah, isn't it interesting? I don't know if most people have never considered, and I had never considered until 3 years ago, never asked the question, why does sex feel so good? Have you ever asked yourself that?
Um,
You ever wondered why sex feels so good?
I certainly accept that the sex drive is there to make us procreate, and also the way that our sex drive works is for selective breeding, so that people will procreate with the people who are going to supply the best genes.
Yes, I mean,
So
and in a way,
there's certainly in animals such as humans, you're going to get emotional attachments between people who procreate, because that helps them make a good team to raise their young. So,
yes,
so certainly, I think all these things most people would accept.
But why do you think sex? I don't know if you believe in a creator. Do you believe in a creator?
I think it's more. I would believe. I don't worry too much about whether there is a being that you could call God. I do believe in, just as I believe in a moral dimension to life, I more tentatively believe in a spiritual dimension to life. And I certainly believe that meaning and purpose are important to life. Have you heard of Viktor Frankl?
Yes.
Okay. Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a book that doesn't rely on belief in a God or belief in a religion or a belief that anybody is looking after you. It's about a man, a psychologist who went through Auschwitz, and his experience in Auschwitz, what he took from that is that even in the most horrendous situations, you can find meaning in your suffering. You can find a purpose in your suffering. And that doesn't depend on somebody, that doesn't depend on the idea, well, God had his reasons for sending us into the gas chambers. I think it's more like, if you think of the Stephen Lawrence murder, you have the actual murder was meaningless. You had a group of racist thugs chasing a black teenager for no particularly good reason. They probably didn't mean to kill him. They probably just meant to hurt him. That led to a senseless, tragic death. But Doreen and Neville Lawrence made him, created meaning out of his death by challenging the police, the Macpherson report, by Doreen starting various charitable foundations to help teenagers and black teenagers. And so you can say that Stephen Lawrence didn't die in vain, because Doreen and Neville Doreen and Neville found purpose in that situation, and did something that made some good come out of Stephen Lawrence's death. So in that sense, I feel that we can all make meaning out of our lives. I can't hear you.
I just missed that last little session. You're saying that gave him meaning. Okay. This is really veering off the subject. The reason why I asked
it is a bit of a digression. Yeah.
That's fine. I don't mind. We can go back to that later. But the reason why I asked you that question is because we're talking about sex and why it feels so good. And it never occurred to me that sex feels good because our DNA, or if you believe in God, then God designed it in such a way. I struggle with that idea, but our DNA has set it up in such a way, or evolved in such a way, that makes sex feel so good, so that we procreate. And if it didn't feel good, if you felt the pain, for example, if men felt the pain of birth and labor when they were conceiving a child, I don't think there'd be many people around. Now, that's not true that there wouldn't be anybody, because there are people who go through hardships to have children. But that's another whole discussion, because the reason why they do that is because we live in such a pro-natalist society. And, as I said, DNA is programmed to do whatever it can to make sure that it reproduces, or that each person reproduces. So the way I see it is, it's as if it's almost as if DNA is using life forms to spread itself. Yeah, it's like a parasite in a way.
But that's something we've been very aware of. So past societies had because animals have sex because they want to have sex, and they don't necessarily associate having sex with having children.
Yeah,
humans have always known that, and sexual behavior in societies is heavily regulated.
Yes, it
We've
is.
now got.
I understand that, but what I'm saying is,
we can be more.
but
yeah,
we're coming back to the point about Brave New World and Aldous Huxley.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that although you think it might be dystopia, right, and it might end up with dystopia if the technology is used wrongly, but I think the idea of the idea of separating sex from reproduction it has the potential to be a wonderful thing, because it means that because in the lab and there's a guy in China who already I think he's in prison actually, but there's a guy in China who is involved in editing the genes of a child so that he didn't have, I can't remember which illness it was that they edited out. It wasn't possible that they had one particular illness. So the idea that people could have pleasure without, and we already have, of course, vasectomies, and we have contraception, but the idea that to separate completely sex from procreation, I think would be a great thing if it was done the right way. Having said all that, that's just fantasy land. It's nothing to do. It's something that I have absolutely no control over. But I think it's important to reframe or tell different stories, because life is all about stories. Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, speaks a lot about this, about how everything is really just a story, and we need to create new stories about life, stories that challenge the notion that life is a gift. Because what kind of gift is it when you can't give it back and you don't have a choice? and it involves suffering, pain, and death, even though there are lots of wonderful things about it. You know, and I want to reiterate whenever I can that my own experience as a father has been, you know, has had many moments and hours and days and of joy and pleasure and delight, and has forced me to become less selfish than I was, and forced me to grow, and has been also very painful at times, very painful and very difficult, but it's also been full of joy, and it's you know, there are many great aspects to it all, but you know, yes, I agree with that, but you know, but that doesn't, in my opinion, that can never compensate for the pain and the suffering that is also tied up with physical existence, and the exploitation and destruction of so many forms of life that we are, you know, we are accelerating towards. I mean, I've just, for example, you know, and since I've become, I don't like to call myself anything, but since I've come across the idea of antinatalism, since I've become opposed to the idea of bringing people into existence, my whole life really, my whole life has changed really, or certainly the way I see things has been completely changed. It feels like I've been reborn. It's a bit like, you know, born again Christian. I'm a born again antinatalist. So that when I watch programs like Seaspiracy, I don't know if you've seen that, but it's just so shocking and so awful what we're doing to the world, what we're doing to the sea, what we're doing to the fish, what we're doing to ourselves, what we're doing to other people. That the only, you know,
but we have changed a short while ago in the conversation. You seem quite amenable to the idea that yes, the principle of antinatalism could be applied to animal life as well as human life.
Yeah.
Now you're okay. I can certainly understand, let's say we're creating chickens to be miserable in factory farms and then killing them at the end. I think a lot of people, including myself, would agree with you that if certainly if that chicken would have been better off never being born, there's no excuse for going into Kentucky. I could
Yeah.
certainly I could certainly go along with you there. Almost forgot my.
But you're saying what you're saying is,
but if we're
maybe I
talking
should be in
about
favor.
you're worrying about destroying the fish in the sea and so on.
Yeah.
If animal life is the same, it's the same human suffering, that you think, why should you bring an animal into the world? Why are you so worried about destroying the fish in the sea and the environment?
I'm not so, yeah, it's a good question. It's a very good question. I'm not so concerned about about the extinction of any particular group of mammals or fish or whatever, or any sentient species. I'm not so, I'm not, for example, okay, I'm not at all upset that the dinosaurs went extinct. Yeah. I'm not really upset that anything that can suffer went extinct, and I wouldn't be. I'm not upset by the idea that we will go extinct. Although, you know, obviously that part of me is, because a part of me can see that, you know, that as well as the abundance of stupidity in humans, there's also quite an abundance of intelligence, and you know, and there's and although there's an abundance of suffering, there's also plenty of joy in the world, and although there's abundance of ugliness, there's also an abundance of beauty. And so to some degree, I would also feel some pain when I think about the end of it all. Having said that, and also so as I say, you know, any specific species, I'm not that bothered about a species going extinct, but Seaspiracy is not just about going extinct, it's also about incredible cruelty. You know, the way fish and sea life are killed and treated, and you know, whether and then there's now factory farming of fish, and that's got its own horrors. So yes, the problem is that if the whole thing could be turned off in a moment, then that would be ideal, in my opinion, just to turn the whole thing off, and then there will be no more suffering. But the whole thing is so independent, everything is so dependent on everything else and interdependent on everything else, that by doing that, you know, by having so many people on this planet, and those people having all those needs, and those people exploiting everything from the seas to the land to other people, it's all, you know, we're heading for God knows what. I mean, you know, as ecosystems start to break down, you know, people, you know, never mind just climate change. There are some people who don't believe in climate change. Okay, let's forget climate change, but you know, all the other problems of as Seaspiracy, for example, explains that, you know, if you get rid of the dolphins or the whales, then they're doing a very, very important job in terms of keeping the sea and the sea life alive, and that has an effect on us. So it looks like it's going to get very, very ugly. So
So you're thinking that the world is descending into chaos and greatly increased suffering?
Yeah, I think so. I think we are
Right.
seeing the breakdown. I think what's happening with COVID, and not because of COVID, because I think we've been deliberately misled and deceived, which is absolutely, it's impossible for that not to be the case, because the system is that's how the system works. The system of governance. I don't like to use the word government, because that's not what they are. They are a mafia. I think the mafia system that's been put in place is just a kind of natural progression of life itself, and I think
as
that
you know, because originally I wanted to debate you about COVID, and in particular, because I'm a very strong believer in vaccinations.
Yeah.
What I would say, I actually think that in many ways the government hasn't been tough enough. In fact, my feeling, and where to me, I kind of, you know, the part of me that thinks Boris Johnson's a sociopath, I'm putting it slightly for effect, that not really literally, I think, but the if you like, that I'm feeling like the government are acting like sociopaths, is I feel that unlike countries like New Zealand or Australia or South Korea, which has said, right, we want to make sure that nobody dies of COVID that doesn't have to, you know, we want to get it as low as possible. I felt that in this country, it's actually been determined by the NHS. So
okay.
if the government's afraid the NHS is going to if people during the early autumn, when it was clear that people were dying, death rates were going up, the government wasn't doing anything, and they were still promoting the Eat Out to Help Out.
Okay,
and
this is a completely different discussion, and I'm, you know, I would in theory I would entertain a discussion about this, but now I want to just stick to the subject
that's
right
fair
now.
enough. I won't push that. There were
Okay.
I
But
think
what I'm
there's
saying is,
one
what I
point
see,
that's relevant to.
going back to the point, yeah, what I see happening is the collapse of civilization, and it's a house of cards. The economic system is just a story, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
ridiculous story when you think about it. It's again, it's typical of life. It's a
Mm-hmm.
story that is full of intelligence and, I mean, brilliant. The idea of money is you know, on the face of it, is brilliant. It's fantastic. What a great idea, and look what it's managed to achieve in some ways, and in terms of building, etc. But look what else it's managed to achieve, the destruction it's managed to achieve, and look how it, you know, how it's gone from gold standard to fiat currency, and to governments just printing money hand over fist. And I mean, you know, the whole thing is a house of cards just waiting to fall, and is falling. So that's the economy. And then you've got, you know, the environment is falling apart. You know, the scientists are saying all that. Boris Johnson doesn't seem to care about the scientists that speak about, you know, the environmental destruction and the ecological destruction. So the ecology is going down. You know, the whole, like, the political system is just, obviously, I mean, America is a great example of how ridiculous it all is. It's an absolute shambles and a joke. It's nothing, you know, it's not, to call it democracy is just a joke. It's not democracy.
I think I would have some agreement with you that you've got that you have got, while parts of the world like China are becoming really frightening, repressive and powerful, in the West, we're not doing enough to protect basic values of free speech, freedom of conscience, and technology is making it easier to take away people's freedom. So you could have
Correct.
said, you could have said something stupid on Facebook 10 years ago, and you get to a prominent position and somebody brings that up, and you're ruined.
Yeah.
And it is a frightening society that we're living in that way.
Yes, and what I'm saying is that, coming back again, trying to stick
Mm-hmm.
to what we were saying before, is
Yeah.
that I see, I'm a bit of a doomer, you know. That's another reason why I don't think it's right to bring someone into existence. And
Yeah.
the thing about procreation is that I literally did not give it 1 minute's thought, not 1 minute's thought about what it might be like to be born into this world. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
what it might be like for my children to be born into this world, what it might be like for my children to have me as a father, what it might be like for my children to have my wife as a mother.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't, you know, I just didn't think about that, because we're not trained to think about that from a child's point of view. And we're living in a time now where, if people have children now, you know, according to a recent sort of straw poll of some scientists that I happened to see online,
Mm-hmm.
the majority of them thought that we've got a less than a 50% chance of making it as a human race to the end of the century. So why is anybody bringing in children into existence from the child's point of view, let alone all the other problems that everyone that comes into existence creates, which is more pressure on the resources, more exploitation of other people, more exploitation of animals. So that, you know, as I see, because I see it, I've got a pessimistic outlook about life
Mm-hmm.
and civilization. That's another reason, in my opinion, why it's not okay to bring more people into existence. If people want to have a family, then I think that we need to tell a different story about families, and people should be encouraged to have families with people who are already here. So people should be encouraged to adopt, and adoption should be made more available, and should be easier for people. And it should be harder for people to have children on their own, and fostering should become easier. And even better than that, I think it would be possible to change the narrative about reproduction by encouraging people to seek out partners who already have children and have either got divorced, or their children or their partners died. And therefore, if you want to be a mother or a father, you can help someone else bring up the children that don't
I
happen
mean
to
that
have.
that does sound, the idea of seeking out partners who already have children does sound like a good idea. What you're One thing I often hear said in that context is no man wants to bring up other people's children.
Well, I mean, you know, that's again, that's just a story, isn't it, really?
I would
Um,
agree that's a story, but what would frighten me in that situation is I'm going into a relationship. If you have your own children, they may grow up resenting you, but they'll also love you. They know, you know, you're their real dad. They'll accept you as your dad, even though they rebel against you sometimes or resent you as as their dad. But if you're going into a relationship with a woman who has children, it's not just the woman who is deciding whether you're a suitable partner, but the kids have to decide. You know, it's the kids deciding whether you're a suitable, whether you're
Good, good,
a suitable
wonderful. I think
father.
that's great. But I think that's great because, you know, because that gives the also the children a say in the matter, as opposed to, and I would disagree with you about what you said about a father. There are many people who don't speak to their parents, one, both, or either of their parents for many years, or even, you know, until they die.
Mm,
So you have no guarantee of that. You have no guarantee of anything in life. But, you know, if we were to change the narrative about children and saying, stop taking risks, right, with your genetic crapshoot, and
mm,
instead use your resources and your time to help other people bring up their children. You wouldn't necessarily, I mean, there could be all sorts of arrangements, and there
mm,
are. So, for example, my mother-in-law had a dear friend who died last year, who was a godmother to our children, and it was absolutely marvelous. She had no children of her own, right? Her whole life was lit up by our children.
mm-hmm,
Used to come round, you know, take care of them
mm-hmm,
for a few hours
mm-hmm,
on the weekend, hang out with them, talk to
mm-hmm,
them, play with them, be a source of wisdom to them to a certain extent. She loved it. They loved her, and that was her way of, you know, contributing to the raising of children. So it doesn't necessarily even have to be that you were to move in with someone like that. If you wanted to play the role of a carer or an
mm-hmm,
you know,
mm-hmm,
of a mentor or a
mm-hmm,
friend,
mm-hmm,
then you know,
mm-hmm,
then that can also be
mm-hmm.
um, sorted, arranged, and you know, so there's lots of different things that can be done. Lots of different ways that you can get involved with helping raise children, helping parents, and helping children be raised, whether it's orphans and adoption, fostering, being a godparent, being a teacher. There's many ways and many things that you can do, and many alternatives than to taking a risk with somebody else's life without their consent.
I
We
mean, certainly that part of it, I can't fault you with, and I think it would be a wonderful thing if there were more opportunities, if caring for children, there were there was more more options other than having your own children in order to do that were more available, and people had more choices. I think that could be a pretty exciting future.
Yeah, I do, and you know, I don't know how this is the problem. Problem with all these ideas again is because is that the antinatalism is a very radical idea because it opposes life itself in a way. It's
Mm,
kind of taking on life itself. It's
mm,
taking on DNA.
mhm,
But having said that, we are the only sentient beings that can overcome our own DNA. And we do regularly, all the time. We regulate our sexual behavior, for example, even though our drives naturally would drive us towards having a lot more sex with a lot more people than we do.
But we've also
overcome.
done what's done in a more modest way, what's done in Brave New World, which is we've separated, to some extent, separated sex from reproduction by acknowledging that people often want to have sex without reproducing, and that contraceptives are a basic part of life and a fully accepted part of life.
Yes, and so we've come some way. Absolutely, we've come some way along the way. But what I'm speaking about here is really, an unusual and radical and a very niche and minority idea that is trying to change the narrative and challenge the narrative of natalism, which is a word that I'd never heard of before 3 years ago, but it is it is a big part of the philosophy of most people, and most people completely take it for granted and don't even know that there are serious questions to be asked before people reproduce. You have to get a license to drive a car. How come you don't have to get a license to bring up a child? How come you don't have to have
that is a question that people ask. A school teacher has to be qualified to look after kids.
Exactly.
But they go home to a parent who doesn't have to have qualifications.
Exactly.
Now, one thing that I'd say, in a way, okay, to a large degree, okay, this hasn't been an adversarial debate, because I don't have too strong opinions about what is against what you're saying, because I can see that I certainly strongly believe in birth control. I certainly believe that people need to think before they have children. I certainly believe that people who don't want to have children shouldn't be pressured to do so because it's the social norm. Though I do know, I've gone through life with my siblings, and I've certainly seen with my siblings that none of them would in any way regret having children. It's been one of the, if not the most important, valuable thing in their lives. But that's not but I know other people who've been happy without children, and I certainly don't think there should be any social stigma about that. Two questions that I want to ask you, two questions that are still on my mind. One is, okay, have you ever asked your children? I certainly don't resent my parents having given birth to me. I've had my problems in life, I've had my joys in life. But my life is all I've got. And I wouldn't say it's right to say I'm grateful to my parents for giving me a loving home and doing their best for me. I wouldn't say I'm grateful to them for giving birth to me because they didn't do it for my sake. They wanted to have kids. But I'm certainly glad that they did give birth to me. The question is, what do your kids say? Do they say, are they glad that they've been born? Or do they say the world's shit, it's all going down the Swanee? Why didn't you put a thing on the end of it instead of having me?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is about my children is that it's a little bit unfair for me, especially as this is going out live, for me to sort of say
Fair enough.
what they think and what they don't think.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll share a little bit with you. You know, I think the idea of, you know, whether they feel grateful to have been brought into existence or not, I think that if they were honest about it, I think, and certainly if I'm honest about my own experience of my own life, I think, you know, there are times when I'd rather not have been born, you know, when I'm in intense pain or when I'm in intense mental anguish. You know, I've had thoughts all over my, you know, all through my life in different moments, and then there are other moments where I have lots of joy and pleasure, and so I think it's, you know, I think it's a question that it can move in different waves. And having said that, at the moment we don't speak about it a lot, but they've all said that they're, you know, so far that they're happy to have been brought here. The thing is that they're young, yeah, and we don't know what's going to happen to them. We don't know what's going to happen in the world.
Yeah.
And another interesting part of this is another argument of many. There are so many arguments that support antinatalism, but another argument is that we have children when we haven't had the whole experience of our lives, yeah. So imagine, I wonder if there would be less people in the world if the decision to have children only was made once you, like, you know, once you were in your 70s or 80s, and your, you know, all your teeth had fallen out, and you know, half your friends had died, and I don't know, you were suffering from dementia, and the thing about having children, I don't even like to call it having children, because I think it's because I think that's part of the whole trick of nature, that make that, you know, the fact that children are so cute when they're small, they're just so cute. And I think that one of the reasons why that is because you know, if they weren't cute, you'd probably chuck them out the window when they were screaming in the middle of the night or driving you nuts, which they, you know, well, they do. All parents get driven nuts by their children at different stages. So so we talk about having children, but we're not having children, we're having people, and those people are going to live through all sorts of things, and those people are going to die, and most people don't think about that when they have children. So, you know, so one of a friend of mine has recently done a little poll on Twitter saying, how would you like your children to die? Yeah. And most people don't consider that their children are going to die, and most people don't consider that the way their children is going to die is probably going to be rather ugly.
I'd like them to die in their 90s or in their sleep after a healthy, happy life.
Yeah, exactly. And how many people do that? How many people have a really happy, healthy life and die in their 90s in their sleep?
And
not that many.
Not most, no.
No. And so, you know, and we have children, we impose life on other people when we haven't experienced the whole of our lives. And those people are they're not just children, they are going to grow up into adults, and then they're going to grow old, and they're going to have to work to make a living, you know, and you know, the fact that your parents brought you into existence, and you said at the beginning that you found it difficult to get well-paid work. It's your parents' responsibility. Yeah. I mean, on some level, it's not their responsibility because it's their parents' responsibility. So I actually hold the creator, if there is such a thing, of this reality responsible for this mess up, right? But your parents bringing you into existence meant that you then have to work for a living. Yeah. And in my opinion, you know, it's work is really a form of slavery. I mean, it's a very nice slavery these days. You know, it's relatively speaking, it's a much nicer slavery, but there are billions of people who hate their work, and they're forced to work because their parents had them without having enough resources to ensure that their children didn't have to work if they didn't want to. which is another reason not to bring people into existence, unless you've got a huge amount of money. But even then, that just mitigates one part of the story. Yeah. So
being rich can be a curse as well as a blessing.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I'm not saying that only rich people should be can have children. I'm saying I'm an antinatalist, and it doesn't make any difference. Yeah, but people who are poor, who don't have enough money to take care of their children, just make it even more difficult for the children. Yeah, and just make,
I think I think it's accepted in society that if you shouldn't be having children if you can't afford to give them a decent life.
Yeah, well, lots of people
Decent
do have
life
children
doesn't
like that.
necessarily mean sending them to private schools, sending them on skiing holidays to Switzerland, but
No, it doesn't.
They're decently fed. There's a decent home atmosphere, and
they've got good health care.
Sorry,
they've got good health. That they've got good health care.
Yes,
that they've got they've got a decent place to live, and they've got heating, and that they've got and that there's enough money also for for things to happen that you might not expect to happen. So, for example, even someone who has got a good job, yeah, there's no guarantee that they're going to have that job in 5 years' time or next week.
Yeah.
So if they don't have the money up front, all of the money up front needed to bring up a child, and most people don't have any idea how much it costs. And I didn't have any idea, and I didn't even think about it, right? But it costs a huge amount of money to give children even even a basic, decent, reasonable existence. And why would you only want that? Why wouldn't you want to give your children the absolute best? Why wouldn't you want to send your children to a private school if necessary? Why would you want to send your children to any school, I would say? But why not send them to a school where there's only 5 people in the class rather than 40 people in the class? Why not one? At least you should be able to have the choice to do that. Don't you want your children to have the best health care? Don't you want them to have the best education? Don't you want them to not to have to? Do you want your children to have to work in in menial jobs that they hate, but because you haven't provided enough money, because you think
there's a difference between
think that it's okay to bring children into existence, take care of them until they're 16 or 18, and then they're on their own. What's that all about? I think parents need to think about being responsible for their children the whole of their lives.
I wouldn't. I think, well, in a sense, parents are responsible. When you grow up, parents would generally expect their children to take responsibility for themselves as they become adults. But caring parents would still be there for them if their children are hitting trouble. So if their child of 40 suddenly becomes homeless, of course they give them a roof over their head.
Yeah.
And try and set them back on their feet. So the job of parenting, if you're a genuine caring parent, doesn't end when that child is 18, even though they're going to leave the nest between when they're 18 and 28 normally.
Yes, I agree. But the point I'm trying to make is that we're talking about finances, and I think that people should learn in school exactly how much it costs to bring a child into existence, and to consider what type of life they want for their children, and to consider what the possibilities are of them either not being able to work, or not having a job, or there not being any jobs, and what they do in that situation, whether they've got enough resources to be able to insure as an insurance policy really for their children, if their children were not able to work, if their children were disabled in some way, or their children were unwilling to work, or didn't were may have mental health problems or physical health problems. So I think that all has to be taken into account. And even then, of course, I'm still opposed to bringing new people into existence when there's so many people here that so desperately need help, so desperately need your time, so desperately need your resources. So
okay.
you know,
I've got one final question that I want to point to put to you, which is that there does seem to be, as with a lot of ideologies, a potential for people to take it in a very dark direction. And an example that I would give you is the Nazi euthanasia program, where I've seen documentaries where, okay, you've got a really evil philosophy going on there of anybody who doesn't fit the thing is dispensable. But the way that it was put to the nurses who actually had to do the euthanasia, so you may have had a child with Down syndrome, and I think and certainly I've worked with adults with mental disabilities, and people with mental disabilities often live very happy lives. Doesn't mean that all their lives are going to be happy. I've seen some horrible things as well, but certainly they are capable of living, of getting wonderful joy and fulfillment and giving joy to those around them. But these nurses were trained to believe that they were doing something compassionate, they were putting them to sleep, they were putting them out of their misery. And because there are pretty evil people and sadistic people and malevolent people, that the idea that human existence is bad can be used by them as a way of justifying mass murder, and often mass murder that is particularly cruel mass murder.
Well, I mean, my response to that is that you know, any ideas can be twisted and spun by all sorts of people with nefarious intentions. I personally think, and you know, I take everything I say with a pinch of salt, as well as anything anyone else says, because I'm aware of the huge cognitive biases involved in our thinking, which make it very difficult for us, and I talk about myself, make it very difficult for me to be really open to opposing views, especially ones that I've become very attached to. Yeah. But I think that the philosophy is actually the most compassionate philosophy out there, because it is all about preventing harm. And so it's not about, it's you know, I don't oppose people helping people who are already here. And, you know, in fact, just today, for example, someone stopped me on the street and told me how much they appreciated the videos that they watched, because it gave them a lot of confidence in the street and confidence when they are speaking to the police. And you know, and I get quite a lot of that feedback, and I enjoy that feedback. And you know,
your videos with the police are fun, and the feeling I have watching them is that some of the police are enjoying it as well.
Yes, the police, some of them enjoy it, and some of them are subscribers to my channel. But what I'm saying is that you know, is that I'm not opposed to people doing whatever they can to reduce suffering in the world. I think that's very important. Yes, and you know, a lot of what I've spoken about over the years before I came across antinatalism was challenging the cruelty in the world, you know, whether it was promoting veganism or challenging consumerism and corporate, you know, corporate behavior, and you know, all the terrible restaurants and the exploitation of people in far out places to make all our stuff, and the exploitation of the environment, and the exploitation of animals, etc., etc. And so I'm very much focused on compassion. Antinatalism is known in philosophy, and I'm not a philosopher, but antinatalism is known in philosophy. It's in the category of what's called suffering-based ethics, and it's for people who care about suffering. And I think suffering and reducing suffering is the only important thing, really. Perhaps, you know, increasing bliss is another way of reducing suffering, you might say. But
would you be prepared to have a trade-off between increasing bliss and reducing suffering? Well, most people would say some suffering is worth it. So to give an example, okay, most women would say yes, labor was very painful, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, yes, there are people that say all sorts. Some people really like suffering, yeah, and suffering and pain can also be good for a person to help them develop once they're here. But that doesn't mean that the suffering had to be there in the first place, because what I'm saying, what antinatalism, from my point of view, antinatalism and the opposition to reproduction of sentient life is really very much based, very deeply based in the idea of preventing harm, because prevention of harm is always superior to reduction of harm. Yes, once we're here, I'm all for reducing harm to yourself and to other people as best you can. But as well as that, a much more profound and effective way of reducing harm is to prevent beings who can experience harm from being brought into this existence, especially now that there are 7.8 billion of us here, and especially now that we see the runaway inequality with these billionaires who have hundreds of billions to play with, so hundreds of billions of pounds or dollars, and then you've got billions of people who haven't got a pot to piss in. So yes, any ideas can be used, to justify all sorts of horrific things. And I think that's why, for example, I don't know, but I think that's why the most prominent philosopher who speaks about and has written about antinatalism is a very private person, because I think that because he's written about it so extensively, I think he's probably worried that someone's going to, read his book and then go around and, end a whole load of people's lives, saying, well, David Benatar, which is his name, wrote in his book that, that life is, you shouldn't be reproducing. And therefore I concluded that by going around ending loads of people's lives, I've done them all a favor. And so he keeps himself very, very private. There's no pictures of him on the internet. And he keeps
but I am genuinely afraid that there are people like that out in the world.
There are definitely people like that in the world, but they will be there in the world. They will use. There are people like that in the world, and they will use all sorts of justifications for doing what they're going to do, but they will do what they're going to do anyway. And I would say, by the way, there are people like that in the world, and this is where perhaps we can, call this conversation to an end and maybe have another discussion about vaccination. Sure. Because my problem with the whole medical world, modern orthodox medical world, is that it is tainted with huge big businesses that create an absolutely awful conflict of interests between the well-being of humanity and the desire to sell them all sorts of medications, one of which is vaccinations, which is an absolute wet dream for someone like Bill Gates
Okay, I
become
certainly
more
have
and
to
more
say
wealthy from it.
vaccinations is something that I really strongly believe in.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, we'll leave it there.
I'll
This
leave
isn't
it
the time to
there.
have that conversation.
But you
Maybe we can
certainly
have another
kept
chat
me
about vaccination.
interested for you kept me on. You kept me interested enough to be on here for an hour longer than I'd intended. So respect to you, and it's been. I think it's been a great discussion.
It's been a lovely discussion. It's lovely to
Thank
meet
you,
you, and I wish you all the best.
and you.
All the
Okay,
best. Bye.
bye.